Hello everyone, this is Namrata. Hope you all are doing good and staying safe. This is a continuation session related to single sign-on implementation, where we will be implementing the single sign-on in our DevOps. In our previous session, we have covered in depth like what is single sign-on, advantages of it, what is the difference between the inbound single sign-on and outbound single sign-on. Then we also covered what is a service provider and the identity provider, and what and all the various steps required for the SSO implementation. If you're watching this session first, I suggest you all to please watch our session 1 prior to this session. So now let's understand the various steps required for the SSO implementation. These are the various steps that are required. So prior to that, we also have to ensure that our my domain is configured. So I will walk you through that as well. So these are the steps that are required to configure the inbound single sign-on. Step 1 is create a federation ID. Step 2, you will have to set up your service SSO provider in the Salesforce. Then as step 3, what you have to do is you have to link your identity provider to the Salesforce, and then we will verify how it works altogether. So let's go to our Salesforce DevOps and let's see the my domain. So here I have already logged in into my Salesforce DevOps. You can see that under the company settings, you have this my domain. When you navigate to the my domain, this my domain is already configured. So my domain URL is one stop youtube.my.salesforce.com. So this is the my domain URL. Now let's go back to our users and try to create a federation ID. So let's recap. What is a federation ID? Federation ID is a unique attribute to identify each of the user. So let's try to create that unique attribute for each of the user. For now, what I will be doing is I will be creating the unique identifier for this specific user. When you scroll down under the single sign-on information section, you will see the federation ID. So here I have already configured the unique identifier for this specific user. So what I have done is I've used the same username and I have configured that specific username as the federation ID. According to your standard company protocols, you can create a unique identification for that specific user as a federation ID. Once you have done or created a federation ID, let's save the details what we have created. So that is the step 1. So it is mentioned over here from the setup we entered, and we under the single sign-on information we have created the federation ID. Once the federation ID is created, now let us try to get into the step 2. Here as a step 2, what you have to do is you have to work with your identity provider to gather all the information. So if you recall, what is our identity provider here? Here the identity provider is the Axiom Heroku application, whereas we are considering the Salesforce as the service provider application. So let's log in into the Axiom Heroku web app. So let's go to this specific step. So let's log in into the Axiom Heroku app. So I've already logged in into the Axiom app. It says that this is specific application which is mainly used for the single sign-on testing and the troubleshooting suite. So let's log in into click the SAML identity provider and the tester. So here these are the different sections we have: configure, generate, and the login. So in order to configure, you have to download the identity provider certificate. Let's click on this and download or copy that specific certificate. I have already downloaded the certificate and copied to my folder. Once that is done, let's go back to the single sign-on and try to enable the single sign-on, and then be followed by the other settings. So from the same setup, try to find out the key in the word single sign-on. If you see that under the identity section, you have the single sign-on settings. So here there are following options available for the single sign-on. Either you can make use of the delegated authentication if you are using any web services. But in our case, as I mentioned, we will be mainly using the SAML session, that is a federation authentication. So let's try to edit it and enable the SAML federated single sign-on using the SAML. So whenever you are opening it for the first time or you're trying to configure it for the first time, this will not be enabled. It will be disabled by default. So you have to come here and enable the SAML enabled checkbox. and click on save. Once that is done, you have to create a new SAML single sign-on settings. So here I've already created one, but for our demo purpose, let me try to create another one. Give the name. What is the issuer? Issuer is a unique URL that provides your identity provider. So all of these details, you have to gather it from your identity provider. In our case, it is Axiom. So let's go back to our slide deck and verify what all details we have to key in. So this is the issuer. I am copying the details from my slide deck and will paste it over here. Identity provider certificate. This is the authentication certificate issued by our identity provider. So whatever we have downloaded, we have to copy it, and the file size should be 4 KB. Let's copy it and upload over here. Request sign-in certificate, it is as is. Here, what is the request signature method? It is mainly a hashing algorithm for signed request, either SHA 256 or SHA1. Let's use the SHA1. Assertion certificate, let's not worry too much about it. What is the SAML identity type? Since we are using the federation ID from the user object, we'll have to enable this button. Then SAML identity location. It is this specific, what does it mean? Way to locate the user's identity. So identity is in the name identifier element of the subject statement. So it means Salesforce username or the federation ID is located in the subject statement of the assertion. Whereas if at all you are using this one, it means that it is mainly in the attribute element. When you use this, that's where you have to give the attribute name and the format. If you are using this, there is no need to provide any attribute name. Once that is done, rest all remains the same. Let's go back to the slide deck. Select the identity, HTTP redirect. Service provider initiated request binding. We have to select the HTTP redirect. Let's select that. And once that is done, you will have to enter the entity ID. Entity ID is a unique URL that identifies your identity provider as the recipient. That is the domain URL. That is something that you have to get it. So let's go back to the domain. This is, so you'll have to use this. This is the ID, and you have to go back to your page and click on identity provider URL. Give this. Sorry, that is something which you have to. Identity provider login URL. No, let's not give any of this. And let's try to save it. Yeah, here on the right hand side, you see the after the API name, you have the entity ID. Entity ID is something, whatever you copied from your my domain, you have to give the entity ID over here. Let's go back to the section over here, which is display to make sure that entity ID includes the HTTPS and references the Salesforce domain. So it should basically look like my domain dot whatever the my.salesforce.com. Yeah, you can see in details, right? Enter your my domain, which is identified on your aux domain page. You have to copy that, and let's try to update it. Okay, that is not opening for me, and what I will do is I will try to. I have some problem with my browser over here. Let's go back here. So here is the entity ID. Let's give it as HTTPS and click on save. Oh, does not fit. You have used this combination of the issuer and the entity ID in the earlier or configuration. So that is why, because this issuer is already configured, right? So let's cancel it. Let's go back to this demo. When you try to edit it, here you can verify all the configurations that we have entered. Let's close this. Let it refresh, and then we will try to re-verify all of those configurations. So here you see I have entered this. Um, this is my domain, signed certificate. I have used the federation ID, HTTP redirect, and I've used the identity location, that is specific location is the name identifier element of the subject element. Once that is done, click on save. Now let's go back to our slide deck and let's see the step 3. So here in the step 3, return to the Axiom web application. If you don't have the app open, you will have to open it once again. You have to click on this and generate a SAML response. Let's go back here. I have this. Here you see, once you have you have completed the configuration step, right? The second step is generate. That is, click on the generate SAML. Matching the configuration set in the Salesforce above, generate a SAML response. If you already have a SAML response, skip this step. We don't have the response, right? Let's click on this and let's go back here. Let's try to expand this. Okay, yeah. So here, as a SAML version, what you have to do is you have to choose the 2.0. Let's choose 2.0. Once that is done, username or the federated ID, that is something which you have configured already. That is, let's go here, pick up the specific federation ID here, whatever we have configured for that specific user. Okay, ensure there is no spaces. Issuer is the one that we have already configured earlier, which we have got this details. You'll have to come here. Rest all you will have to remain as is. There is no other changes apart from this. Recipient URL, the URL from the Salesforce SAML single sign-on settings page, it is at the bottom. So once you open this, when you click on this, recipient URL, end section, when you navigate here, where is the recipient URL? Entity ID, yes, this is the entity ID. When I open it, this is the entity ID. What is the recipient URL? Let's go back and read it again. The URL from the Salesforce SAML single sign-on page, login URL. When you click down here, you can see that this is the login URL. Copy this and paste it over here. Once that is done, entity ID is something which you have already copied, right? Click on request SAML. So as a step 1, last step is you have to click on the request SAML response. When you click on the request SAML response, here you see that whatever we have entered, all the details will be updated over here. Here we are using what algorithm, SHA, then what is the reference URL. All the details what you have configured will be showing up over here. What is my unique identification? All those details will be updated here. Now here you see that recipient URL is one stop dot. So that is my domain, right? Now when I try to click on login, so this is how you verify whether your implementation related to the Salesforce single sign-on is working fine on. How do you verify? When you click on login, so basically this is a third party application, right? Identity provider application. So from this particular application, you can also log into your Salesforce. So here you see, you were directly able to log in into the Salesforce without providing the Salesforce username and password. So once the user is able to log in into the network, so consider that this is the network. When I go back, so this is my network. Once any user with the federation ID has configured, has logged in into the network, so using that specific username, the user will be automatically able to access all other applications. So when I click on login, I have not given, because I already logged in, right? So let's go back, request, and then click on login. So you will be routed to the Salesforce application, and it has not asked you to provide any username and passwords. So that is the importance of implementing the single sign-on. So that's how we have configured the entire single sign-on in Salesforce. You have a concept called as an identity provider. Here we are using the identity provider as called as Axiom Heroku Web App, and Salesforce is treated as the service provider. So that's how we have enabled the single sign-on that will let our users to access the Salesforce from within that specific network or any other application without entering the username and the password. So using that federation ID, Axiom application logs into your Salesforce. So this is what we have for today's session. Hope you were able to understand key concepts which are related to the single sign-on. What is single sign-on? How do we configure the single sign-on? And then we also verified how does that single sign-on works. That's all for today's session. We will plan for another topic soon. Until then, please to take care of yourself. Signing off, yours Namrata Kadiyala. Bye bye.